When he was 15 years old, Kenneth Branagh's life changed after seeing Derek Jacobi perform Hamlet. 20 years later, he directs Jacobi in his own film adaptation of the Shakespearean classic. Branagh also wrote the screenplay and stars in the title role. He brings the epic tragedy to the big screen in full text and 70-millimeter film. The 4-hour adaptation is set in the 19th century and opens on Christmas Day, and I am pleased to have him back at this table. Welcome back.
Thank you very much, Johnny.
Why did you, at this time, tackle this huge project?
Well, it has been something that's preoccupied me, some would say obsessed me for the last 20 years. Certainly when I saw it, I was so overwhelmed. It was my first major theatrical experience. I went on my own to see it. I went to see
This was in Belfast?
No, this was back in Reading. We'd moved. I moved when I was about 9, and I was about, at this stage, 15, 16, watching TV's I, Claudius, Derek Jacobi. That's why I'd gone. I didn't know anything about Hamlet. And it was such a thrilling evening. The theatre was pulsating with life. It just, the whole experience got under your skin. I couldn't believe that all of this passion and emotion could be in one piece. And at the end, you get a wonderful physical climax with a sword fight, which was brilliantly done. And, as Kenneth Branagh once said, the experience of watching a great play means that, we sometimes understand a little more about why we're alive. Well, when I left that, I don't know if I understood that, but I did feel alive. I felt better. I felt that I just went away with a feeling of excitement. It stayed with me for days. So when I got to drama school and started to become an actor, it was a part and a play that began to be the focus of my attention, and I got a chance to play it in the intervening 20 years, including a production that Derek Jacobi directed me in. And it's been a process of trying to understand as clearly as I can a story which is subject to all sorts of cliches, sad man in tights, old skull, self-indulgent, navel-gazing. Why are we interested in such a kind of melancholy bugger? And finding, as I felt was there, and a kind of very lively, curious, bright, vibrant story that is not about people predisposed to be manic depressives, but people struggling with the business of being alive, i.e. dealing with grief, the loss of one's parents, family crises, when suddenly your mother marries again to someone you don't approve of, in this case your uncle, sibling relationships between Laertes and Ophelia, the rivalry, from men for the affections of women in tight sort of family groups, all of these things, plus a great thriller story. Yeah. And the challenge to try and, tell a great story and have this wonderful debate about human issues is something that at this stage, I thought, I must do this, I must do it before I get too old.
Yeah, because you may want to play it differently if you were too old, or you have to play this when you're a certain age.
In the text, he's 30. He's 30 years old, and I think that's significant. It's one of those casting issues where, by the time you get old enough to perhaps understand it as fully as it needs to be, you may be a little older than you should be. Olivier was 40, for instance, when he played Hamlet on screen.
Now, tell me about this. There's a thing in which I say Jacobi, and Jacobi is what's the correct pronunciation? Jacobi. He presented you, after your performance on stage, I think, with the Red Book, which was a text.
Wonderful, beautiful Red Book, which goes back as far as Forbes Robertson, who was a Hamlet at the turn of the century, and includes Michael Redgrave and Peter O'Toole and a number of people who passed it on with the idea that it should be given to the person they regarded as the next Hamlet.
And so the recipient gets to pass it on and make the choice.
Yeah, and with the proviso that the recipient passes it on to the next Hamlet. So my job is to pass it on to the guy that I see coming up, who's the right Hamlet.
Just to show you that this is not a subject that I was not interested in earlier. Roll tape. This is an interview that you and I did some time ago, maybe 1993, 3 years ago. Here it is. But Hamlet is the character that you, of all of Shakespearean characters, the one that you most like, the most want to play, most enjoy, feel the most range for?
Yes, because for me, John Gielgud described the part and the play as summing up the process of living, and I think it does. Although Shakespeare very cleverly, just as perhaps he would now if he was writing for movies, he takes a popular form. Maybe today it would be a thriller. Then it was a revenge drama. Yeah. Boy told by his dead father, I was murdered, you have to revenge me. And that's the plot, that's what happens, so the story is, how he does that. But by the by, you have a man in turmoil commenting and reacting in a sort of early midlife crisis to everything that goes on around him, which involves his views on family, his views on religion, his views on war, his views on politics, and you get this incredible mind dissecting all of this because his emotions and his intellect is intensified and sharpened by this awful situation that he's put into. And so it's the byproduct of a great yarn is this incredible debate about everything, that celebrates the glories of man and the utter insignificance of man in the cosmos. So with that kind of, material, it's endlessly fascinating.
When will you put that on film?
Well, I don't know. There have been 81 film versions of Hamlet.
And Mel Gibson did the latest, I guess.
Exactly, yes, and did a very good job, and I don't know that the world is waiting on another one, but I'm a little too close to the last production to quite know when or if, but I'd love to. What's
significant is that version that Mel Gibson did on film was about, what, an hour and a half, 2 hours?
2 hours, I think, just over 2.
The full text version is over 4 hours.
It's 3 hours, 58 minutes.
Okay, almost 4 hours.
Edition, yeah.
But you also, because of the theater owners, made a 2-hour version, a 2-something version?
Well, in fact, there is a just over 2-hour version, but that will only be available to perhaps airlines or the odd country that won't show it.
Because I had, in fact, heard that most people said, no, just offer the 4-hour version.
Well, in fact, the response of cinema owners, partly in response to customers who've anticipated the film, thank God, have said, no, we want to see the full version. They've decided to treat it with the kind of event status that we hoped they would, because you ain't going to see this every 5 minutes. It is the full-length version, and it is easier to watch. I promise it is easier to watch. Shakespeare's structure is that much more compelling because you get a chance to allow him to switch mood. You have an intense moment, he changes it with comedy, he quickens the pace, he slows the pace, he gives you kind of breaths to take it in. In cut versions in the theatre, a lot of these intense set pieces are squashed very close together. It's harder for the actors to play and it's harder for the audience to accept. I think that this is a more complete entertainment, and you do get to go to the loo in the middle.
So there is a break halfway in.
There is a break halfway through.
Putting it together, did you feel, because of Frankenstein was not a huge success?
No, by no means.
By no means. At the same time, you haven't changed. I mean, all that talent that everybody, had proved so much in other performances and in other films and in other theatrical productions was still there. Do you feel like you've got to prove something here? Do you feel like this is...
I had something to prove to myself, which was that it was important beyond the considerations of oh, should there be another Hamlet, oh, is it right to do another Shakespeare, that in fact I should follow my instincts. This project was about following my creative instincts. If I had to prove something, I suspect the last thing on earth I should try and do is do a 4-hour movie.
Wait, 4 hours is because of the time, not because of the complexity of Hamlet?
Well, a bit of both, but I mean, basically, just in terms of trying to get it financed, it was an enormous challenge. And as you can imagine, even since it was made, and right up to now, really, when the tide is beginning to turn, we hope, we touch wood. I mean, within the business, from people who said, well, this is sort of commercial suicide. It's all right to go back to your own territory, but why don't you do a nice comedy? Why do you have to give us something that was done 6 years ago? Well, because I passionately believe that it hasn't been done the fullest justice to on screen, because people have not included every character, they've not had a chance to make the connection the play makes between the very personal story of a family in crisis and an epic that changes the ruler of a nation by the end of the play.
So when you set sail to do this, it was more a question of confronting rough seas than finding a safe haven?
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that even I begin to realise, without trying to blow my own trumpet, this was a brave thing to do. It was a brave thing for everybody to be involved in. People American actors came in, people like Gerard Depardieu came in, actors who were unfamiliar with Shakespeare who came along because they wanted to join that particular unique event, knew that everybody was up for grabs, they weren't paid much, it was undoubtedly a labour of love. And I remember for the first time on any film I've made, I gathered absolutely everyone together the day before we started shooting, about 300 people, including the caterers, the drivers, just to say, whatever happens to this film, we're doing something unique. I'm not saying it's better than any other film, but I'm telling you, we're doing something unique. This is for our kids, for our kids' kids. This will never be done like this again. And I believe, whether this version of it is acknowledged or not, that this piece that we're doing in its entirety is one of the greatest human achievements in the history of art across all the disciplines. That is a fantastic privilege to be involved with, and we should enjoy it. And we did have a wonderful time, and there was great camaraderie, and we all sort of tried, very hard and very humbly, I think, to come up to this fellow's writing, with the idea that this was a one-off, a wonderful one-off.
Come up to this fellow's what?
Writing.
Oh, his writing.
Yeah.
Oh, so in other words, Shakespeare had set the bar pretty damn high.
Very, very high,
and you better be at your best if at least you're going to do just fairness to the words.
Exactly, because this is an immensely complex and elusive piece. We have wonderful materials. I, thank God, had an enormous amount of experience with the part, or as much as you can get and still be young enough to play it. People like Derek Jacobi had been in the play many times. We had so many Hamlets in this. Jacobi, who played it, John Gielgud, probably the Hamlet of the century at 92 years old. Is it
the Hamlet of the century?
Well, if you're to believe what the history books say, and if
on the
Olivier
evidence... played Hamlet?
Yeah, but do you know that many people feel, and on the evidence of recordings of Gielgud, audio recordings, and some snatches that were actually caught on film, he was actually offered the chance to play Hamlet by Alfred Hitchcock. Can you believe that? In about 1930, when Gielgud was the sensation of London. And he also played it on Broadway, and he chose not to do it because he didn't think much of the film medium. And I think a decision he regretted for the rest of his life. But the audio recordings of him are quite wonderful, because he managed to be lyrical and romantic and complex, wonderfully intelligent. People say about Olivier in his Hamlet, of course, that as soon as you see him, that you can't believe that he wouldn't immediately avenge the death of his father, because this is a complete action man. You know, he's so much more Henry V for some people than he is Hamlet.
Well, I was just going to say that, sir. I mean, Henry V you took on, even though it is one of the great Olivier performances.
He took it on, of course, having had extraordinary performances in the past haunt him. The great advantage he had in absolutely putting his seal on it was that he was the first one to do it on film. All of those other great performances by Henry Irving or Forbes Robertson were ones that were caught in print by wonderful critics, people like Hazlitt, or not in that case Hazlitt, but people capable of Hazlitt's gift of describing, as he did with Kean. He said watching Kean was like reading Shakespeare by flashes of lightning. Just a wonderful way of putting it. And Olivier had all those to follow, but then he did it on film, and that kind of, you know, it was there. You could refer to it, and there it is still on the video shelves all these years later. But, you know, the recent Romeo and Juliet, I think, proves the point that with an
Which has been accepted well.
Sure, and an utterly radical, quite brilliant version of the play, quite different from Zeffirelli's version in the late 60s, which also really struck a nerve. Right. Both absolutely tap into the heart of the play. Both seize the idea of adolescent love and all its preoccupations, sex and violence and danger and illicitness, in exactly the same way, but from completely different points of view. That just shows that this man's material is classic.
Yeah.
I mean, it is
Richard III done in a very different time.
Absolutely. Over the centuries, of course, you know, there have been hundreds of different stage productions that will set Hamlet in anywhere from a mental asylum to a circus. And so it's now one of the more prominent examples in film of the way in which a classic text can be taken by Olivier, by Mel Gibson, Richard Burton, you name it, and each time, the time itself and the people who do it throw a different light on it.
Speaking of Burton, he never did it on film, even though he had a brilliant performance on stage here in New York.
Well, do you know that was recorded on film, and I think it was played for one day.
The play was recorded on film.
Yeah, yeah. So they did it, and it produced and presented as a film, and played in this country for one day, like a school holiday or something, where all the schools in this nation, I'm told, were brought to it. So there was an enormous box office take for one day. Burton himself didn't like it, and so he destroyed almost every copy, but there is one remaining. It's the National Film Theatre in London, and I was very privileged to get a copy of it. I have, yes. Oh, what a Rogan peasant. Sleeve it, I. Wonderful voice. And he was sexy. God, he was sexy, charismatic. He was another one, though. You just felt, well, if he has a shred of doubt in him, I don't believe it. But
well, do you have a shred of doubt in you?
Well, some people would argue that I don't, because I certainly don't agree with the theory that Hamlet is predisposed to be melancholy. Everything in the play that's written about him suggests a very lively intelligence and someone who faces problems and has great potential. Fortinbras says had he been put on, he would have proved most royal. Claudius says he's loved of the distracted multitude. This was a popular guy who really had every chance to be king. You know, when his father died, had he not been at Wittenberg, and Claudius, as Hamlet says, popped in between the election and my hopes, Hamlet could have been a great king. Instead, he's faced with the traumatic circumstances of his father's death and the knowledge with the visitation of the ghost that the man on the throne actually killed his father. That's what plunges him into this bitter, angry, non-melancholic, brooding, yes, excitable, yes, volatile, yes, but I think he's not disposed, except at moments when he recognizes it himself, to fits of self-indulgence. He always catches himself on, and it's spectacular in the Rogue and Peasant Slave soliloquy.
All right, before we get any further here, clip 2 is they pray you throw to earth this woe. Say that line for me.
I pray you throw to earth this unprevailing woe, which is Claudius's advice to Hamlet to kind of get a life.
Roll tape. The language it's just amazing. I mean, you think, well, I mean, it's so comprehensible and so powerful and all the things that are...
Well, we had such a joy with this cast. Derek Jacobi in particular is such a master of naturalism in Shakespeare, of just making it sound as though people are talking as we are talking. And there are some wonderfully complex scenes that exist in the full version of the play, particularly a scene in the second half when he deals with the Laertes and they plan the kind of the duel that they're going to cheat on Hamlet in. And it's a scene you never see in its entirety in the theatre. He does it so wonderfully well.
In preparing for this, two questions. First, did for a moment you say, although I've done it all before, maybe this time, for this role, I'll let someone else direct it and I'll just be Hamlet?
Well, it's a funny thing, Charlie. I mean, these two things are so interwoven. I wanted to play Hamlet in a film where I felt that every other character was done justice to. In the theatre, for instance, the women characters, which, quite frankly, if Shakespeare isn't revolving in his grave, are underwritten. The character of Gertrude is a hugely important figure in the story, has less to say than the first gravedigger, and yet she's one of the main motivating people for Hamlet. It's an extraordinary relationship. To have Julie Christie in there and to be able to see in reactions and in illustrative flashbacks a chance for that story to develop, for Ophelia's backstory with Hamlet, which we choose to play as a physical relationship, to talk about the outside influences, Denmark about to go to war, Fortinbras about to invade, the sense that the country is on edge, not just this family, was very important to me. I would have been sad to play in a production of Hamlet where, you know, where in fact the prime concern was just me, you know, and vice versa.
You're preaching to the converted when you talk to me about doing this kind of thing, because, I mean, it is, in the end, your vision will bring out the best of your acting.
Yeah, because, you know, once all those things are there, then Hamlet is stronger too. It isn't a story about just one man.
Second part of the question, though, did you go to look at Burton's Hamlet and Olivier's Hamlet and other Hamlets to be, in Gielgud's Hamlet, to be informed?
Well, you know, I gathered them all. I had them all, more than that. I had Richard Chamberlain's, I had Ian McKellen's.
Right.
And I got them, and I rarely watched them. I would occasionally look at a moment to see how they'd solved a particular problem in the play, but I didn't watch them in total, because once we started to prepare this, it was definitely our own thing. It became our own thing, and we chose a look and a setting and a feel for it that was, at least in film terms, original.
Why did you choose this setting?
It was a time in Europe, you know, that we wanted to evoke, a time when large extended royal families, the Habsburgs and the Romanovs, you know, had an enormous amount of political power, where there was much intrigue and scandal within those families, and where much of the bickering and many of the arranged marriages that went on ended up regularly changing the borders of Europe. So it seems evocative of a time when countries changed hands quite regularly, and when there was a lot of scandal and intrigue about the people in power, but they were royal families with direct political power. It was also a sexy period to look at, opulent and rather corrupt, you know, and full of excess, of which, you know, the Tsarist regime is probably the clearest example. So we borrow in terms of colour, costume styles and shapes from those places, but it's also an impression of that time, so that we keep as unspecific as we can in order not to nail the play down. It's not about the 19th century, it's about Hamlet, and the 19th century, in this impressionistic way, I hope, lets the play go.
Sure, I understand. Get thee to a nunnery. Set that up for me.
Well, we have Hamlet and Ophelia meeting each other for the first time since she has been barred from his company by her father, who believes him to be mad for her love. We've set up a physical relationship between the two of them. They adore each other, and now, having not seen each other for some time, in the intervening period, she's breaking her heart over him. He's been told his father was murdered by the ghost of his father. They need each other more than ever, and they're further apart than they ever possibly could imagine.
Roll tape. Very well. How many takes for something like that?
Well, that's the kind of thing where, you know, the intensity of the scene. This is Hamlet probably at his most distressed, where he feels most abandoned by, in his mind, yet another woman. And so it's the kind of thing that technically in that set was difficult, because there are so many mirrors around and so many potential for reflecting the camera, seeing the actual camera, plus the intensity of the scene means that you rehearse it technically as dryly as you can. For that, maybe 4 or 5 takes, and probably you'd get it 2 or 3.
It has all kinds of
all sorts of technical things, but you've got to be very careful when you sort of tie yourself to something like that you don't under or overcook the acting in the meantime.
Cost you $18 million to make this film,
Indeed.
Which is cheap by anybody's standards today.
It certainly is. Somebody said the other day it looked like a $75 million movie, and I was delighted to hear that. The 70mm helps enormously.
Yeah, I want to ask about that. What's the difference in 70 and 35?
Well, the difference is the film is this thick. If you roll it out, it looks like a series of postcards. It's 4 times the size of, 4 times the amount of negative than in 35mm, and therefore the picture quality is so much sharper at its best. The skin tones and the colours are richer. The landscapes, you know, look 3D at times. It's just a wonderful, extra memorable element to the piece, and it was particularly thrilling to use it with this kind of period setting.
And finally, someone comes to you and says, Mr. Branagh, there's a lot of stuff I need to do with my life. I'm a very busy person. Tell me what Hamlet means to my time and the life that I have with myself and my family going into a new century.
Well, I guess I'd say, on one level, if you want to be entertained, you just want, you know, 2 hours double feature length for the price of one movie, and you want to be entertained, see this. If you want to, you know, if you're interested sometimes in wondering why you become anxious or upset about anything, if you're not permanently happy with your life, if you sometimes wonder why you feel sad for no particular reason, why you worry about things, if you have any problems with your existence at all, if you are anxious about anything, go and see a man who has the same kind of issues and who deals with them through the words of a very, very great poet, and you'll walk away inspired.
Kenneth Branagh, star, director, producer, Hamlet, opening across America on Christmas Day. We'll be right back.